Hi guys, welcome to week 2 of Debates About Capitalism, where we tell you all the big arguments you can make in a capitalism debate and then proceed to tell you why those arguments don't always work. Now, in this week, we're going to look at companies, which is a huge area of debating, right? Pretty much every debate tournament you go to, there'll be some topic about companies, at least one, sometimes more than one. And they're a great aspect of any other debate, even debates about social change. Now, in a capitalist free market economy, the idea of firms or companies play an important role. And there's the theory around firms, right? And what role that firms play or companies play in an economy. Okay, so I'll break it down very simply. And this is the idea or the understanding, right? So if you have a company, and this is why companies are very important, companies build the economy and are the basis of this whole economy or society, some might say. So for example, let's say you have a company here that sells, donuts, right? Company does really well, starts up, people don't buy donuts, so company then starts to hire workers, more and more workers. So company then also expands, gets bigger, right? Becomes like this donut megaplex, opens up to other parts around the country, and then hires more workers in those parts of the country, right? So company does really well, okay? And that's part of the theory. So if you encourage companies to grow, companies are the ones that create jobs. It isn't so much governments themselves creating jobs, although governments sometimes do. And in some countries, civil service is a big employer. But in many countries, the civil service isn't the major employer. And most of them are either small and medium industries like the donut shop, or when the donut shop becomes huge or becomes like if you say manufacturing, like the car industry, in Korea, or the telecommunications industry, in other countries, especially in fields of manufacturing or agriculture, they can be huge and employ millions, thousands of employees, right? Now, for this company to grow, company will need investment. Okay, so this could be the company owners taking loans from banks, so you need banks to give the money. Or the company will sell shares and then many people will buy into that, right? And when that happens, you can see here, many people's fates become tied to the company. So the workers need the company, shareholders, right? So let's put the shareholders here. Okay, and these guys are wearing hats because they're richer. They also get their fates tied into the company, right? Because if the company fails, shareholders will end up losing all of their money. Okay. The growth continues. Company gets even bigger. Company starts to export, right, to other countries, puts the donuts on a big ship, sends it over. Okay. And then, gets more larger. And here the country then starts to get income, right? Because it gets a foreign currency exchange. Other countries are buying their stuff. The country as a whole becomes richer. So you see the economic development happening on two levels. One is internally in the country, right? It encourages internal consumption and encourages growth. People get jobs, and then from exports. Okay, so for all of these things, you need companies. So the economic theory or the capitalist theory is that the more freedom these companies have, the more likely they're going to succeed, right? So if the employer has the freedom to hire as many people as he wants, then he's going to increase, he or she, who's going to increase production, okay? And if they have the freedom to set up companies wherever they want, then they can increase growth. If they can have friendly regulations, they'll make more money, right? So the companies, if they can do all of these things, then companies will help the nation. Companies also give tax to the government, and the employers will also give tax to the government. But if you lower the tax, what can they do? They can grow more. They can hire more people because now they're not paying nasty amounts of tax to the government, right? And they can reinvest that tax into people. So they get more and more people because of all of these different incentives that the government gives them. So in the capitalist framework, what governments need to do is step away from companies. Capitalists, like very small governments, gives great amount of freedom to companies. The enemy of growth from a capitalist environment is government regulation, right? Or government intervention, because they say governments don't know what's right. But what happens if companies do bad things? Well, capitalists say that there is check and balance because, there is another donut shop over here. Right? Well, maybe not right next to each other. It may not do very well. Or maybe it should be right next to each other because there will be competition between these two guys. And then people can choose. And not just customers can choose, workers can choose too. If workers get treated badly here, workers will move to another place and then they can get jobs there, right? And similarly, externally, because other countries will also be competing for that same market. So if the car industry is, subsidized and very, very inefficient, then you're going to lose out to another car industry of another country. So from a capitalist framework, what countries need to do is reduce barriers. They should remove trade barriers or tariffs or taxes and let the competition happen. And if you let competition happen, then there will be balance and it will reach equilibrium because the market will sort itself out, right? And that's where you get the growth from. So the secret of growth, the superstar, you guessed it. That's a really bad star. I'm going to do another one from start. There you go. The superstar are the companies. Okay? Now, the counter theory and what some people say, and not just like these anti-capitalist, pro-protectionist people, but even the father of capitalism, or modern day capitalism, the free market theory, Adam Smith, said that in order to get a market in a equilibrium and pure best competitive element, there needs to be some kind of fairness, right? So he said he argued against the existence of monopolies. He was also against really a lot of capital being locked into certain groups, certain companies, even certain people. But he was for very high taxes on inheritance, and I think maybe even against inheritance in whole. But basically, the idea is that the market, in order for it to be balanced and really competitive, you cannot have too much inequality. And when there is a lot of inequality in the market, then you don't have the competition, right? So these two donut shops can only really compete with each other if one of them isn't so much more powerful than the other one, right? If one of them is so much more powerful, like 100 times bigger, there's no way the other donut shop can compete. Because the other one will just have more convenience, more change, shops everywhere, and they can compete on price. Because they can lower, that's a donut, very ugly donut, but lower the prices of donuts because they have more capital, right? And you see that happening with chains. So if you want to get a cheap meal, the cheapest way to do it is to go to a fast food chain. And chains can sell food cheaper than other places because they have a huge scale. They can bargain in bulk with producers, with sellers, and even with their workers, and they can afford to push down their internal costs. So other small shops find it much harder to compete. But so what? The chain's huge, right? And the chain is employing, remember, these hundreds and hundreds of people. But the chain gets to that stage by squeezing everything on the production line. So what also happens is, I'll put over here, you get a situation where you have the companies and a few people who control all the capital. Okay, these are the capitalists at the top. And then you have all the workers. And in the free market capitalist freedom model, that some of which we discussed last week, in the individual perspective, is that if the individuals work really, really hard, then they will be able to move up, right? But if the distance here is so far, like here it looks, quite achievable. But if it's really, really far, it becomes very hard for you to move up because you need many things in order to move up. You need access to capital, you need networks, you need all these other things, and you can't. So you end up becoming dependent on the capitalists, right? So these workers over here can't really hop over to these other guys because the other guys are also doing the same thing. And if they want to go somewhere else, they're also doing the same thing. So they're moving from one low wage situation, let's say, to another low wage situation, and they get trapped in a low wage cycle, right? So there's no way to kind of break out of that. right? So that's one argument against the natural check and balance, and one argument for government intervention. Okay. The second argument for government intervention is that governments, this whole idea that companies do all of these things on their own is a lie. And the idea that governments, these companies will then do stuff, inadvertently, whether they want to or not, for society and help them, is a lie, right? Because the workers here, these guys, will be educated by, guess who? By the government, right? The infrastructure here, the ports and stuff, is provided by the government, right? The roads that the donut guys use to deliver stuff is provided by the government. So all of these things are provided by the government, and the companies will not be able to succeed or do anything if the government didn't create this infrastructure. So this means that, number one, governments need to create this infrastructure first. Without this infrastructure, it's very, very unlikely any kind of company will be able to succeed. And two, companies owe a lot of their success to the government. But wait, companies are paying tax, right? So will that tax cover all of this stuff? Yes, but that means that you need to have reasonably high taxation, and companies, remember, argue against taxes because taxes means less jobs. So that's one. But two, taxes don't cover the whole picture. Because there are a lot of other things that are involved in it, and especially when you talk about the notion of infrastructure. Taxes mean that once a company has already developed, or the taxes argument, then the company can pay back for it, right? They can pay for future growth, or in recognition of the government's role in their development. But there's another question of whether or not the governments should actively encourage companies to grow by investing in companies, by by doing these things like setting up companies and growing them. And that's a big issue when it comes to the whole capitalist framework with companies, because remember, the capitalist mindset was governments need to step back, and governments don't know better than companies, or can't know better than the market. But what a lot of other people are arguing is that not only can governments know as well as the companies do when it comes to the market, but governments need to, because if governments don't take the first step, it's very, very unlikely that companies are going to be able to set up and grow because of this big gaps that exist, not just between workers and companies, but also between companies and companies, between big companies here and small companies here, right? So what you get is small companies being swallowed by big companies, or unable to compete with those big companies. And in fact, many, many successful companies today were companies that were started by governments a long time ago, and then eventually broke off and became their own, right? So now the point is that not that governments should always be creating companies, but I guess it comes down to a balance. To in what extent should governments intervene in the capitalist framework when it comes to companies, and to what extent should they step back? Because there is merit in the argument that companies can grow and they can compete with the market, but only when there is some kind of leveling playing field in the market. But there's also some merit to the argument that governments sometimes need to take the first step, build infrastructure, and start a company, right? Anyway, rich ground for debate, and a very, very colorful portrait over here. So let's go into the topics we're going to cover to understand this a little bit better. Okay. So the first issue here, the ratio between the highest and lowest paid employee in any company should not be more than 25. Now, 25 here is a bit of an arbitrary number. Doesn't really matter. If you want to justify this, you can try to say, look back at what the norm was, 70, 60 years ago, where the gap between the highest and lowest paid employees in the company. But the basic idea here is about fairness and efficiency, right? So, fairness in the sense that if the gap is getting, so remember the triangle we drew, I'll draw it, laterally. So this is lowest and this is highest, right? So nowadays in America, America primarily is where this problem is biggest, it can be up to 300 times, right? The difference between the lowest and the highest. So the first question is on fairness. Like, is this fair? Does it make sense that this person over here is 300 times more efficient than the lowest paid employee, right? In the company. And it doesn't make sense. And it can be even more like 200 times more than the average paid employee of in the company, and that also doesn't make sense, right? So there needs to be a gradient, but is that gradient fair? But secondly, it also talks about whether or not it's efficient, and it comes back to this idea of people moving up, right? If the gap is so big, it's impossible that these individuals will be able to move up because it's just so far for them to climb. And when that happens, the people over here can't get their rights protected. They lose faith in the capitalist system. And this creates harms within the company, right? But it also creates harms in the economy and the society. Because I'm earning so much lower than the other person, you kind of end up killing your market. And the people here struggle to survive, right? While the people on the other side here enjoy themselves and have fantastic, wonderful lives. So from a government's perspective, should governments step in and intervene? So governments can, create minimum wage, and this can be some of the approach on the opposition side, not to be against helping people, but finding different ways to help people on op, right? But on gov, you'll say like what you need to do is stop the stretch, the unfairness, because if governments are just giving minimum wage or welfare, then that just encourages more and more exploitation, and that's what it is. It is exploitation. So governments need to create. They can be some differences, but they can set a cap on the maximum amount. And if you want the top people to pay more, then pay the bottom people more also, and then the whole scale can move up rather than one side moves up and the other side moves down. Right? On op, you say help the people at the bottom, sure, but doing this will limit the effectiveness and competitiveness of companies because they can't hire the best people, and they're going to find ways to hide the payments to the people on the top anyway, because companies are very good at doing sneaky things like that. And what you need to do is develop the people at the bottom and create more opportunities and create more competition at the bottom, so people at the bottom can also start to fight for more pay and move around and then become more competitive, right? So you have to take using more capitalism and freedom investment from op in order to break this system, but don't necessarily justify that it is fair to have this such a huge wage gap. It's a debate about which philosophy is best suited to find solutions in the short term and in the long term. Okay. The second one is about subsidizing and protecting strategic infant industries. We'll discuss this in more detail. And the last one is about whether or not companies should have community representatives on their BOD. Okay, so this comes from the idea that the BOD is part of the check and balance on companies. We give companies all this freedom, but the freedom and a lot of that freedom it should be managed by the shareholders, right? Because the public owns the company, and we trust the board of directors to manage the company. And that's why the governments don't step in and do things. Well, the governments have laws, but beyond those basic laws, like environmental laws and labor protection, etc., it comes down to these individuals. Now, what's happened in a lot of companies is that the individuals aren't really active investors. It's a lot of, like, say, big funds or mass amounts of people that don't take direct active control in their companies. So you don't really manage it, right? To the extent which you invest in a company, you want very quick returns. So what that does is it encourages the CEOs of the companies to make profits very, very quickly. And for them to do that, they squeeze their supply chains, they pay low wages, they put off investment, they're trying to make a lot of profits for the investor. When investors get profits, then the investors are really, really happy, and they pay the CEOs, or they approve the CEOs huge, huge burdens. So the board of directors, which is supposed to overlook the future of the company, just kind of looks at profits, which is problematic. And it makes the whole view about profits, right? This debate says that one way to regulate that is not to just put more laws on companies, but to put community representatives in the BOD. So to encourage more dissent, more voices, different perspectives in the board of directors. So now there'll be some people in the board of directors whose view isn't just about how can we make more profits and how can we develop the company, but their view is about how can we create sustainable development and how can we look out for this impoverished community here and how can we protect the environment and do something else in the community, right? So their role isn't so much, they're like kind of like a devil's advocate, right? Their role isn't so much to say like, how can we make more money? But like, yeah, maybe that's going to work, but what about this group? What about this? What about that? What about this? And they'll have voting power, and they can create a little bit of balance. Okay? So that's the Gov case, pretty much. It's a way to give some flexibility to the company, but encourage more voices. Talk about how the company's growth now will be better in terms of involving all the stakeholders. So you'll have a little bit of discussion about the role of the company and why the checks and balances in the current system in the status quo have failed, right? Then talk about why this is better. Talk about why it helps the company, helps the community, and helps the long term too. A lot of company directors want long-term success, but are driven to short-term ones because of the pressure from shareholders or to make a quick buck. This way now they are forced to think long-term, and it'll be good for them in the long term, right? Because they're going to involve the community. It makes the community also think more favorably of the company, right? And feel like the company is part of them. Or you say that companies can do this already because they have consumer pressure. And in fact, you need to have more and more consumer pressure in order to do this, not just pick some community representatives. Two, you say that this is going to slow down the company. It will mess things up in the company. It's not the role of the board of the directors. It's just about them making profit. And profit is sustainable profit. You attack or you don't disregard this idea that the whole system is broken just because some companies can't seem to do it right. That companies more often than not get their balance right. And companies always think about the long term and are often very, very willing to make sacrifices, right? So don't buy this idea that the whole thing's broken, nothing's going to work, that you can still, do things in the long run, and keep hitting on growth. If you're a capitalist, you want growth, and then a little bit more of growth. And you get that growth by giving companies this freedom to focus on these things. I'm against monopolies and all that. Let's have some competition, but make it about growth. And if it is about that, then companies in this organic free system will think of a way to make things work. They'll think of a way to get all these things together. But if you mess it up by forcing people to be there who shouldn't be there, you're not going to get this fantastic growth. Okay? Excellent. Let's go into one in real depth, because depth is powerful. Here we go. The government should subsidize and protect strategic infant industries. A very big issue here in Korea. Well, at least it was in the 70s and 80s, and became like the reason of this nation's success. One reason among many other reasons. So let's get into the debate without me going on and on. In terms of definition, I think the key things you need to define are here, strategic and infant. Okay, so strategic here will mean some kind of national benefit. So talk about jobs. It has to be export oriented, right? So like a small industry that doesn't really impact many people isn't going to be strategic. Infant means it's young. Pretty straightforward. Subsidize and protect here gives you a lot of space. I don't think you need to pick one or two specific policies, but talk about, broadly giving funds, helping to set up the company, okay, at the start, and then using some kind of tariffs to make sure that company can grow in the long term, right? So the goal is, in principle, to help companies become stable and export ready, right? Because the premise that you're going to develop here on Gov is that the global market is way too competitive, that if we just make that the small companies that set up cannot survive because other companies already exist in that field, know so much more about them. Or even if the company is new, they'll just buy the other company or like kill them through competition, right? And it's important to have local companies. So it's not just enough for you to open the market and let other companies come in, because those companies aren't loyal to your industry or to your country. When things get bad, they will leave and they will move somewhere else. But local companies will hire local staff, will invest locally, will build, and will become the national champions and heroes that you need. All right? So the stance is to ensure sustainable development and fair competition, right? And this is a little strategic because from a capitalist framework, you're doing something that's unfair, but you are arguing that I'm doing it here because the status quo is unfair, right? So this creates more fairness in a way. Okay, so 3 arguments. Industry needs help to grow. You need locally based industries to guarantee jobs and staying power, and stronger national industries leads to more diverse competitive local markets. Good. So the first argument here is the one I was making earlier about that the global market is too powerful, right? There's too much power that you cannot compete. You just cannot if I just set up and someone grows, right? In today's world, it's really hard, right, to do that. The big new companies that come out of China do it with Chinese support, Chinese government support. It'd be really hard to think of many companies. Sure, there may be some, but very few of them manage to do breakthrough, wonderful, magical things and develop and become huge powerhouses without this support, right? So you talk about that there's the global competition is too powerful, the playing field is uneven, okay, and why uneven, and why we need that kind of support in order for those companies to grow, okay? So you create the basis that it'll be impossible or highly unlikely otherwise. And secondly, and you talk about why it's important then to have them in your country. Because the first argument, a response to the first argument could be that, well, it's okay, we don't need these national champions. Let's just open up our economy and other countries can come in and set up here. And there will be a faster route to development, right? But then, so in the second argument, you say, why, even though that happens, you still need local companies to become champions, okay? Because you need to guarantee local jobs, and local good jobs, local high level, high value jobs. Because if your country just becomes a manufacturing base, then your workers are just factory workers, right? They just are the low level, the operators and operational staff. And the company is there because of cheap labor. And when labor becomes expensive, then the company is going to go to another country that has cheap labor. So what actually happens is that it becomes like a cheap labor kind of trap, because there's no way for them to move up. If you have your own companies, then people within there can kind of move up and develop. And yeah, the country still gets an advantage if there's cheap labor, but when labor price moves up, the whole country can kind of move up together, right? Because the local company is not going to leave to another place. They may move manufacturing to another cheaper place, right? Like in Korea, many may move manufacturing to another place where labor is cheaper, but they can retain most of their high level design, development, all of those things here, still benefiting the local citizens. Okay, so that's why you need locally based industries, the local jobs, and for staying power when things get tough or when labor prices or labor costs move up. The third argument is trying to step back and say, like, it's not just about this country, but it's about everybody, right? And this is you trying to give a win for the world. Okay, so you say that you need, the whole part about capitalism is diversity, and it needs competition. If we exist in a world where we have one or two dominant countries, say America, or Britain, although Britain isn't that much, but still quite dominant from the manufacturing sector, now move into services. But if you just have, let's say, America, if just in a world of Apple versus Samsung, there's some competition, but not that much diversity, right? Because they still are only measuring themselves against each other and then end up looking a lot like each other. And if they want, they can both charge high prices and you're kind of stuck. So you need markets where you have, or a situation where you have 3 or 4 other people. When a Chinese brand jumps up and comes into the play, that shakes things up a little bit and forces the other big guys to think about what they're doing and maybe pull back or change or do something different, right? So in this argument, you say countries that are investing in and protecting and creating new players in the economic market may be protectionists now, but in the long run, they're creating a better, more competitive global market, right? If the Korean government didn't help develop Samsung or Hyundai or Kia, right? Then you wouldn't get these brands now that are challenging Toyota, that are challenging Apple, that are challenging GM and all these other places. So countries need to be smart and plan, and people still need to work hard, but you need to help people give them a little bit of leg up now And in the long run, you're going to get more diverse, more competitive global markets, right? So this last argument is you trying to win the capitalist argument as well, okay, from the kind of protectionist approach, right? So that's the Gov approach for this motion. Talk about the development of that country. Talk about how capitalist markets nowadays don't have financial check and balance and impossible to compete. Focus specifically on why it needs to be local, not just inviting other companies into the country, and give them the big win for the capitalist market in the big picture view, right? So in the long run, it's still going to be good for everyone. Looks like a really good Gov case. What do we do on op? Let me tell you. Opposition, no. The no is very important. This is coffee. So on op, you say no. No. You take the capitalist line. Create conditions for growth, and growth will come. You need to have freedom. I distrust governments. Governments sometimes have made successes, but more often than not have led to failure. And the problem is the philosophy and the worldview. If governments feel like they know best, then they're going to keep intervening. It'll become like your mother, right? The moment you concede something, that's it. Then she'll be like, since that time, see, I was right. And then forever, they're going to intervene. Okay, so you need to maintain independence of companies and of the market. The op will say like, I'm okay with governments creating the best conditions. So what are the best conditions here? Tax conditions, infrastructure conditions, right? Build the roads, build the ports, build the airports, provide power, do all of these different things, educate people. That's what the government should do, but don't set up companies and don't protect them because that anti-competition is bad, okay? And you argue how it's counterproductive in the long run. So you can concede that maybe some short-term gains because you build a company, but that company becomes dependent on the government. That company will not be able to compete in the long run, and the government will continuously subsidize that company, and it'll become a burden. Okay? So, 3 arguments. Firstly, it's political, it's not business. It'll create waste and harm. Secondly, it will discourage investment and inefficient growth. And finally, it will lead to counter-protectionism and anti-export environment. And this is the external harm part of the argument. So firstly, political. It's not a business decision. While people can say, like in theory it may work, most of the time, government bureaucrats are doing this because they want to help themselves. They make decisions that are populist, right? In order for them to get votes, because that's their goal, to get votes so that they can stay in power. So it's not decisions that the economy is making. If they empower people to make these decisions, then people will be making decisions that they think will work out best for them from a business mindset, not from a political mindset, right? It also will lead to waste when those companies fail, right? But will also lead to dependence, because now it becomes a political entity that was used to surviving based on protectionism and subsidies from the government, and then becomes really, really difficult for that company to survive after that, right? And yeah, that becomes a problem, okay? What that does is, it leads to this disinvestment or a lack of investment and inefficient growth. So it may seem like the company is doing well, but the company is only doing well because there are subsidies and protections, right? And who's paying for those subsidies and protections? You are. So countries will need to tax, and consumers end up paying more in order to get some kind of success. And those who enjoy the success are the governments or the politicians or the leaders of that company, right? So like in the country I'm from, in Malaysia, we try to build a car industry, and it's relatively successful in the sense that it's employed many people. But it also means that we have to pay a lot more for cars, and because there are taxes on other cars, because these, if the other cars came in and were much cheaper, then no one wanted to buy the local car. So that means that the consumers end up having to pay more. And when they can't pay more, they end up paying for less quality products. So where exactly is the growth coming from, and is that worth? So if consumers were paying less for their cars or for their products that they had imported, they can use that difference on other things and develop a more thriving, more active, more competitive, more consumer-driven economy, rather than having to pay a lot of things, because that's the costs of protectionism and subsidy, right? You also say that it'll discourage investment from international companies. Because, look, the law discourages it. It's protectionist and they have subsidies. So they're not going to come in and compete. And when they don't, you have to do everything on your own and you're held back. You don't have the technology, you don't have a lot of the money, and governments will either need to take loans or governments will need to use precious resource on building these companies and taking huge gambles. Okay, so it's not efficient. The best way to do it is if the government has money, build infrastructure, teach the people, and then step back and invite people to come in and set up these factories, set up companies and build. And when they do that, you argue, they will naturally use local talent, and local talent will move up. And then because you have an open framework, local talent will set up their own companies, small, agile, clever, service-based, fancy companies like that. Okay. Third argument is it leads to counter-protectionism and an anti-export environment. What does this mean? This means that other countries who you wants to sell your stuff to will be like, hey, you protect your economy, so I'm going to protect mine, right? You don't let me sell cars there, so I'm not going to buy your cars. I'm going to have tariffs against your cars. Or I'll have tariffs against some of your other stuff. I'll tax my other industry. So what happens is your model fails because you aren't able to break into other economies. The only ones you can break into are ones that don't have the same kind of industries which you have, which means they're not as developed as you, which means that they're much poorer, which means that they can't buy these expensive things that you are trying to sell them. Okay? So, not going to work. What you need to do is, if you want other people to buy your stuff, you need to buy their stuff. And you need to find an area that you can focus on, that you can specialize, right? So this last argument is about a counterproductiveness, about a long-term harm thing. Okay, so if you start to protect, other people will protect, and then the whole international trading system will fail, and then there'll be disaster, and then there'll be Armageddon, and everybody will be poor, and it'll be like, the capitalist's worst nightmare, right? It'll become the Soviet Union all over again. Or maybe not. Something like that. To that extent. Whatever. Make it big, okay? But that's the last part is about how you're not going to get that long-term plan. Okay? So that's basically the op line. The op line is to say that the status quo isn't that bad. Countries can still manage, function, and work things out. The governments do have a role, but the role of governments is to create the infrastructure and create the base, right? Not create the actual companies themselves. And thirdly, if governments do that, then they're going to create problems. They're going to pick wrong people. They're going to get politically involved. They're going to create dependence. They're going to create backlash and counterproductiveness, and that's all going to be really, really bad. Okay? But still, so I hope you can see that it's quite a balanced debate in terms of whether or not they should intervene. It may seem like something that used to be happening only in the past, but actually still happens a lot. Countries still give subsidies to new industries. America gave subsidies to new high-tech or solar power, sustainable energy, alternative energy industries, right? Some of them work, some of them didn't really work. China, a big part of, or many of their companies there were state-run companies that are now privatizing or spinning off. Okay, so and it is a huge issue, and many countries which you think are very kind of capitalist actually do have huge state involvement in their firms. Singapore is another big example, right? So is that justified? Is that not justified? What are the difference between the good examples or the bad examples? But always, and then the examples are really, really important, but always keep in mind that the capitalist philosophy or framework, right? On one side, give them the freedom and then they will grow. On the other side, there's too much freedom, there's no check and balance, governments play a role. Whichever works is whichever you better argue, and whichever fits the context better. Always about the context. That's all for today. Good luck. Have fun debating about capitalism and companies.